Hello and welcome to the Elsewhen Hello.
I love that. Hello. I heard that multiple times by now. Hello.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to the Elsewhen podcast, where we talk to interesting people in product design and technology. We're joined today by Richard Pope, author of Platformland, An Anatomy of Next Generation Public Services. I'm your host, Elliot Levy, and I'm here also with Nadav Mordechai, who's our director of product here at Elsewhen. Morning. The podcast was delayed by a month because you had a very good excuse. You were in front of a committee talking about public services. Can you explain what that was? There's a lot going on at the moment, and maybe actually sort of like delve into how you got there as well.
Yeah, sure. So that was the Committee for Science, Innovation and Technology in Parliament, and they were looking to or reviewing an announcement that the incoming government made around creating a new digital centre for government, and that was bringing together some existing centres of excellence. So the Central Office of Digital and Data and the Government Digital Service, the Incubator for AI, Geospatial, a few other bits and pieces, bringing them together in DCIT for the first time. The backstory being I had been involved with the Government Digital Service back a decade before. So I was part of the initial team at the Government Digital Service in 2011, 2012, where we initially created gov.uk, which replaced 400, 500 odd different central government websites with a single user-centered service designed around the needs of users, and went on to work, help other parts of government, help departments redesign their services and turn the UK into one of the leading lights of digital transformation. So decade on, it was a bit of it's been a reset moment. So I was there speaking, and they also had other people who'd been involved in different ways, different parts of the UK's digital journey.
So why the reset after 10 years? What's the impetus behind that?
So partly it's just 10 years. I think
Right.
actually things have moved on. A decade or more ago, we were designing services that were it was still relatively new. Okay, it was relatively new. Digital was seen as a relatively new thing in government, rather than now. I think hopefully people realise it's core, and what we can do with digital's changed and has moved on. Also, I think it's sort of acknowledged that it lost its way a little bit.
Yeah.
The UK was a leader in digital government, a combination of COVID and Brexit, and maybe not the kind of political drive towards digitalisation of public services. It lost its way a little bit, so it's partly about kind of creating some new energy around that.
Right. Well, it seems like there's a lot of energy right now with lots of stuff going on, AI opportunities plan, and Tony Blair's always there in the background with the digital ID stuff. That's all coming. It seems that there's a lot of momentum happening for a lot more of looking at this in a new light. Is there anything that's exciting you at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so there's three things have come out so far. Was it tail end of last year, beginning of this year? AI opportunities you mentioned. There was also the State of Digital Government report, which basically kind of like diagnosed the problems, which will be familiar to many people worked in and around the public sector in terms of lack of investment, lack of digital skills in government, lack of infrastructure, and then also the blueprint for modern digital government, which kind of sets out some of the vision for where the UK could go. So there's good things in all of those. I think most exciting, I would say, from the blueprint is a commitment to having senior digital leaders in every central government department and changing some of their reporting lines. So actually they have some responsibility outside of their individual departments to a chief digital officer. The other thing I'm really excited about is the potential of his digital credentials. So there's a commitment in there to initially create a digital driving license, which lots of countries have done now, but actually systematically digitize things that are currently letters, bits of paper, emails, like turn them into credentials, so that when someone wants to prove, for example, that they are getting universal credit or that their child's got a disability, they're not unfolding a bit of paper or scanning it and emailing it over to someone in the council. They've actually got a digital proof that it's easy for them to use, and also people on the other side can trust. And I really hope that creates some push demand in the government to start to join services up. So I think that's really exciting. Apprehensive, I think there's it's really good that lots of people are excited about AI and identity. The risk is that particularly kind of special advisors in government end up looking for things that, if it's not AI and identity, they're kind of, like, how does this fit? And I think technologists know that actually it's about using all the tools that are available to you, and AI and digital identity are going to be part of the design of services. They're not going to be in and of itself. So there's a risk that ministers slightly paint themselves into a corner if they kind of ignore some of those. Hopefully that won't happen. There's lots of really, really good skilled people we need more, but there's really good skilled people in working on digital in government. So
yeah, well, having those
we can be optimistic, I think.
Having those senior roles of CDOs finally in the public sector and stuff should hopefully, mitigate some of that sort of, just going after it for the sake of going after it. Yeah. On the Platformland, I guess.
Should we talk about the book?
Yeah, let's talk about the book. Sorry.
So both Elliot and I read the book, and I was curious if you were to describe the main 3 ideas in the book, what would they be?
So it's trying to make 3 arguments, really. One, that public services should work much harder for the public, and the digital tools we've got today, let alone the ones that are coming around the corner, digital tools we've got today, give us that opportunity. The aim of most digital projects, and they do tend to be kind of short-lived projects within the public sector, tend to be the status quo delivered more cheaply. So how do we do this thing we currently do on paper in a call centre using this bit of legacy technology that no one's touched for 15 years? How do we do that more cheaply? And the trouble is that the things that are time-consuming and expensive for the government are not necessarily the things that are time-consuming and expensive for the public. Also, lots of things will work better if we can join things up. So actually, if your point of view is like, how can we make Department X more efficient, you don't have the space to think about like the links between Department X, Y, and Z, and the health service and schools and lots of other things. So I landed on the language of people talk about personalisation in the public sector. I don't think it's like particularly helpful language. People talk about efficiency. I don't think it's particularly helpful language. Both of those things are important in their own way, but I landed on services that work harder for people as a way of kind of hopefully stop helping people to step back and go, are we really solving the needs that the public have? Are we really using technology to its best? So that's the first theme. The second theme is that public services should be much simpler to make. It's we're not quite in the world where we were a decade ago, thankfully, where every public project with some digital element to it was like a 10-year project, costs hundreds of millions and generally didn't deliver. Things have got a lot better, partly because of the revolution that happened in 2011, 2012 with the government digital service, kind of getting modern development practices, user research, use of open source, user-centered design into government. So things have got a lot better, but actually the teams who are creating services, who are trying to respond to the things that ministers are asking them to do, find themselves starting from scratch a lot of the time still, even if they're working in iterative user-centered ways. They need more building blocks to help them make services more quickly. So and the UK did some good work on this. It created something called GovUK Notify, which is about sending messages to people. It's in the process of creating GovUK One Login, which is authentication and digital identity system. So there are elements there, but we need to go much bigger and think about data as infrastructure and think about what's the long list of raw materials that we can give to teams to allow them to build things more quickly. And there are lots of examples in the book from other countries that have done that really well. And then the final theme is that I really think that what we need to think again about what makes public services public is not just about applying the best of the private sector to the public sector. Public services only get better through feedback loops with the public, through co-production with the public. There's an obligation on them to be transparent and accountable. They need to be operated by long-lived institutions that who is responsible for them. I'm trying to bring all those 3 things together. So hopefully I've made something that's useful for product people and designers and technologists, but also policy people as well.
Yeah. I think maybe let's explain some of those terms. So data as infrastructure, for example. Could you kind of explain that for listeners, what that actually means in the public sector in reference to the book?
Yeah, sure. So everyone acknowledges these days that data is important. And, there's the kind of obvious memes that people throw about, like data is new gold. It was like a decade ago. Everyone was saying data was oil, was like 15 years ago. It was like, it was like this is, that was novel a decade ago. I think everyone accepts data is important now, but for running governments, but the way governments manage their data tends to be very suboptimal. So when there is an acknowledgement we need to use data from over here in a different place, Department A needs to use Department B's data, the solution tends to be what's euphemistically called data sharing, but really is copying and pasting data or photocopying data. You end up with these kind of duplicate copies scattered about the system. There's hundreds of databases of addresses, hundreds of databases of people that don't quite match up with each other. Yeah. And sometimes they shouldn't, right? Sometimes there's legitimate reasons for having air gaps, but a lot of the time they should, and they just don't. So one of the arguments the book makes is that rather than data sharing, we should be thinking about data access. So storing data once, making it available via APIs so it can be used by multiple services, with an owned by an organization with clear custodianship responsibilities, so that exists to maximize the use within the public sector and beyond in the private sector as well. And there are examples there from Estonia, India, Ukraine have really invested in data infrastructure that makes it simpler to build services in the public sector and in the private sector.
Yeah. Everyone always talks about Estonia, don't they?
Estonia all the time. And I'm kind of curious whether that's almost a question of size, because Estonia is quite a far smaller country.
Yeah, that's normally that's a common thing that you hear a lot. Yeah, I've done sort of lectures to students quite a bit. I was in the US a couple of years ago on a fellowship and did lots of lectures to students. I've done some over here as well. That is a common kind of throwback. It's like, well, it's so small. It's only a couple of million people, and that's true. But then India is the other end of the scale, and what India's done with digital credentials, for example, there is a government app called DigiLocker, which is a place for citizens to access digital credentials, and it's everything from exam results to proof of address and proof of entitlement to welfare and things like that. I can't remember the number of users, but it's issued like 9 billion credentials. And they've built the infrastructure not just for the public, but the infrastructure for departments and state governments and municipalities to issue those credentials as well. And that's a totally different scale. I think it really comes down to political intent and slightly longer term planning. So Estonia's main play in data infrastructure was something called X-Road, which is something that joins up different departments, different ministries of government, and also kind of handles some of the trust elements, so you know that it's definitely department for health you're getting the information on, not someone pretending to be the Department for Health. But that wasn't useful for a long time. People have done studies, and actually it was only when they had 30, 40 data services connected to it, there was critical mass that it became useful. So they saw the value and they invested in it for the long term. Particularly with data infrastructure, that's really important. Whereas I think the UK has always lagged behind on that, and its data programs have not really lasted more than a couple of years. The latest incarnation is the National Data Library, which is generally, when you see people talk about it, is normally accompanied by a shrug, and people going, yeah, I don't know what it means either. It's long-term investment.
We sat in another conversation some time ago, and the CTO of one of the government offices said, one of the challenges here is that we have legacy systems that are far older than I am, and I'm in my mid-50s.
Yeah, they're still there. I think we should stop talking about legacy systems, because they let people off the hook a little bit.
Yep.
Because people get to go, well, it was kind of broken when I got here. What can we do about it? It's like the weather. Can't do anything about it. We should talk about them as unmaintained systems, and I think really recognise how much they hold back the state and the private sector from designing services. There was a report recently, which is interesting as a class of thing in its own, which I'll explain in a second, but there was a report recently into the state of data in the family court system by Nuffield and Research Institution, and they went down to the level of individual databases and individual database fields to study how they were influencing the ability of courts to do a good job and the police to do a good job and social services to do a good job. And one of the things that stuck with me was when they highlighted the way domestic violence was recorded in a database, and it was a single Boolean on-off flag against a household. So it did not tell anyone whether it was against a child, against an adult, whether it was an external adult. There was like the data is not there. So yes, you could probably try and infer some things from the raw text, but the database is just badly designed. And I think that there's lots of examples of gaps like that across the public sector. And I think the reason that report was interesting is actually, like, should we be doing that on a more systematic basis? So looking at lots of different policy areas that the government wants to make changes and go, okay, what's the state of data here, and what can we do about it? Before you think about then layering AI on top of it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? So it's a shame because it's influencing all the opportunities that are going to be gained, and that's the whole thing. If you don't sort it out, if you sorted it out 10 years ago, you'd be in a much better position today to do all these things. And
but I mean, it's a bit like when's the best time? The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, 100 years ago. But like, so we are where we are today. I think we shouldn't see these things as reasons not to act.
Yeah.
But we should recognise that there are gaps that we need to understand, and you need to put teams around them who can start to incrementally improve them.
Yeah.
Whilst also investing in the future.
Yeah. And there's a much more tangible reason for sorting out your data now as well. So people are like, okay, we're missing out on all this stuff, rather than before it was a bit.
The problem is those sorts of things are less announceable than we've created an AI agent to do X, Y, Z.
The other thing I wanted you to explain a bit about was when you were talking about feedback loops, and there's a lot of that in the book. I think you talk about it as there's ways you talk about it. In some ways it's about democracy and politics. There's stuff in there which I thought would be quite interesting to unpack. Yeah,
sure. So there's a video on YouTube that some Steve Jobs fanboy has created of him saying it just works seamlessly like 50 odd times, and it's like it's an Apple catchphrase. They say a lot, and that kind of works in like for private sector products. Like, okay, this thing just works. I understand how it works. I'm going to buy it, and you know that it's a good product because they are or were the richest company on the planet. They sell a lot of things. The feedback loop there is, it's a successful business. They can sell things. You don't have those sorts of feedback loops in the public sector. The public services only get better through co-production in various different forms, and that may well be co-production through user research. So you show things to people and you understand how they work, how to make it better. But that's only a very narrow type. I think actually they also get better through public understanding of how things work. And also they get better through charities and civil society organisations helping improve things. Yeah. So how do we design our services so that the public can understand them, and so they can understand them and affect change? That might seem, I'm going to unpack that a bit because that probably seems a bit woolly. This idea of co-production comes from an economist called Elinor Ostrom. She started in the 60s looking at the design of police forces in the US, and they wanted to know why. I think in Chicago, police numbers had gone up, and but crime had also gone up, and they were trying to work out why. And it's because they designed this perfect system where they could put them all in cars and get them to the crimes as quickly as possible, but it meant that they talked to the public less. And so crime reduction is a co-production between the police and the public. In a classroom, learning is a co-production between students and a teacher. If they have perfectly designed textbooks that just work, are seamless, and they don't ask questions and they don't talk to people, they don't learn as well. So the parallel with public services is that if we design public services that just work, and we have no communal social understanding of how they work and how to change them, then there's no opportunity for them to get better. Like, what does it mean to live in a world where we don't understand how the government works? Yeah. Not that most people should be thinking about how the government works all the time. They shouldn't, but some element of understanding is important.
And you need sort of that like Kafka protocol of like the worst thing that's happened to the person who's like, lost in the bureaucracy. What's their experience? Like, how could let's take it to the extreme, which not many people would be able to report on because thankfully it probably doesn't happen. But you need sort of all those sort of gaps which you probably don't even know about.
Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge to user-centered design as practiced. So, which tends to be like the primary concern is an outcome, is getting someone to the end of the thing that they want to do, and that's absolutely right. We should design public services so if someone wants to get a passport or complain their bin hasn't been collected or whatever it is, they should be able to do that really simply and get on with their day. Absolutely. But there's some people, they are going to fall through the gaps, and they need a way of kind of understanding how things work, what they can do about it, whilst also making them feel human as well. Like there's a really interesting study by an organisation called the Administrative Fairness Lab, who are based in the University of York, and they interviewed three groups of people involved in the welfare system. So they interviewed designers who worked at the Department for Work and Pensions, designing universal credit, designing the forms, writing the content. They interviewed welfare rights activists, so people who help people fill in forms, and they interviewed the public, so users of the service. Predictably, they found that the welfare rights advisors wanted people to get the money that they were entitled to. Fine, you would expect that. The designers that wanted to design things that were easy to use and got people the outcome, were as simple to use and as simple to understand as possible. The public, they prioritised those things, but top of the list was how it made them feel. Actually, they wanted to feel human. They wanted to know that the person they were going to be dealing with was the same person as last time and would understand their circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think it's a challenge, especially in areas where you have conflicting priorities.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really, if you're designing a commercial service and it's really clear what the outcome is, you don't have a conflict. Like, I want to sell a thing to you, you buy the thing. Great. Government sometimes has conflicting needs to the public, and designing around those is a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a good one. That's why loads of great designers go and work in government, because these are big, hairy problems to solve.
What is some specific advice, Richard, from your point of view, to designers in government that is in effect quite good at working with the public and going through different stages and doing that user research? What is missing?
I'd say two things. I think adding just enough context about how systems work in this, so that may well be little links at the bottom that says who is the minister responsible for this service. It's links to why things have been changed, like change logs. Like the NHS does this quite well, actually, like explaining why things have changed, like documenting that. So a little bit of context about how services work and how they're changing. And the other thing which I start off with in the book is this idea of administrative burden. So actually not just focusing on the immediate needs of users, but thinking about administrative burden. So this is a academic concept which is defined by three types of costs. So there's learning costs, like how do I find out about this thing in the first place? There's compliance costs, how much time do I spend filling in forms, and that may well be outside the context of the service as well. So you've designed this service beautifully, but I also need to get information out of here to over here. You help me do. And thirdly, and most importantly, the psychological costs. How does it make people feel? I think if designers can think about those in addition to the more proximate, outcome-driven, utilitarian, user-centered design approach that we sometimes see, I think it will be. I think we'll get better services as a result.
Yeah, well, that's people talk about like transparency and explainability in AI. It's this transparency, isn't it? It's about being able to interrogate why a system has got to a certain decision about you.
Yeah, it's exactly that. But I think it's reframing. I've been trying to reframe transparency a bit.
Okay.
So because I think people always get to it last if they get to it at all. Everyone agrees it's important, but you get to it last because there's not a clear outcome. There's not a clear driver for the business or the public a lot of the time. Because most of the public don't care about it most of the time. And the business is like, well, why are we doing this? If you can position transparency as a way for the public, especially people who get lost in the system, to help make things better, a way for charities, civil society organisations to understand what are increasingly complex areas of public policy. If they can't understand, they can't help you make it better. And also, like within institutions, I think this applies in the private sector as well. Like if you've got good it's not about documentation. If you've got good open working practices in an organisation, it's a transformation magnifier, multiplier. If you can find out how that team over there in another part of the organisation or another organisation entirely are doing their work, what's on their roadmap, what they did last sprint, if you can understand that stuff, it allows teams to make their own connections. It allows people to work together in ways that don't mean navigating up and down a hierarchy. So transformation as a transformation. Sorry, transparency as a transformation multiplier, I think, is a nicer way of putting it.
Yeah, okay. What's that old saying, isn't it? What gets measured gets managed and all that. So that's making that something that should be a bit more tangible. I think you kind of started talking about it there, but there are lessons from. We always look at the public sector as learning from the private sector. What can the private sector learn from the public sector?
So one of the things I didn't know until I started writing the book, it ended up being accidentally being a history book. There's lots of this like I was like, I wonder who wrote this first. So I kind of went back. I did not know that user-centered design started in the public sector in the UK. So I kind of assumed it was someone at a turtleneck in the West Coast. In the apologies for historical tangent, but I'm going to go there now.
I like it.
So after the war, the British government nationalised the coal mines, and they wanted to introduce lots of new technology to make them more efficient. They sent researchers out to try and understand it, and they sent a researcher called Edith Mumford down the mines to understand how this technology is working. And she came up with this idea called the needs fit method for job satisfaction. So this idea of like technology fitting a need, and she actually went on to work in early computerized systems in banks and government and that kind of thing. And it was her work that got picked up first by a computer scientist in the US and then by designers in the US. So the kind of like the roots of user-centered design are there, which I think is really interesting. And there are lots of examples where actually the public sector, Mariana Mazzucato has obviously documented lots of this. If anyone hasn't read her book, so you should do, where actually the public sector tends to be, if not the leader, then at least the kind of the spark that starts things off. And I think if you look at a lot of the practices that grew up with the government digital service, first charities and then private sector companies have copied that. Lots of people who worked in and around government in that area have gone on to start companies. It's kind of it's had that kind of spark effect there. What can private companies learn today? I think I'd say two things. I think one, a lot of the themes in the book around thinking about your data as infrastructure, API first, so you can enable other people to build on top. The value of credentials to join services together. Like pretty much all those patterns carry over. I think I probably should have written or maybe it's the second book. I don't know. I think most of the patterns carry over to private sector organisations, especially bigger ones. The second theme, I think, is how the public sector and the private sector work together. Historically, I think we've thought of public or private. This is either the private sector is going to do this or the public sector is going to do it. I think technology allows for a much more blended approach where government can create infrastructure that the private sector can build upon. And the private sector can create value and meet needs that the public sector never will do because it's focused on the broader need. And there are examples of this. So the nicest example I've seen recently is from the NHS app, where you can log in and using your NHS ID and you can see your prescriptions. You can get repeat prescription. Very helpful. But if you go to a very long list of private high street pharmacy apps like Superdrug and Better and Boots, you can see the same information because it's been designed API first. And for a user, it doesn't matter. They can use either. It's whatever's most convenient for them. But you're creating new ways of doing business in the private sector, and you're creating public value as well. I think more things like that. So more interoperability over. We shouldn't see, as we have historically, privatization versus public. I think we're going to get more blended, overlapping services, which come with their own governance like questions, absolutely. But I think that's really interesting. So like companies that can really think in those terms, I think will have an advantage.
I want to bring together a few points here. We see different tools. One of them, I think, is the synthetic users that try and imitate how users might think or behave with different products. Do you think there's a place in the market for these tools within public sector, within public services?
I've not come across it. I think, if you don't mind me sidestepping the question a little bit, I think anything that helps teams who are creating public services and also ministers, senior civil servants, special advisors, helps them understand the users of that service. Anything that brings them closer to thinking about use rather than thinking about it would be amazing if we launched this policy and it would be great in the papers. Not saying all ministers do, it's a bit of a cheap generalization, but you know what I mean? Historically, digital delivery has been quite far away from the world of policy. So anything that helps bring those closer together is a good thing. I don't think there's a single way of getting that co-production, those co-production feedbacks I talked about. There's no single way of doing that. So I'd definitely be interested to see how it works. But I've not come across anyone using it. Yeah.
So in in the private side of things, that you would use it for if you had a small data set of people, you can either expand it, or you can maybe go to more niche cases. You can kind of, you're inventing stuff, but it's based on real world data still. So then, for instance, you could maybe test ideas. Would this solve, in your AI synthetic data opinion of things, would this solve this problem for you, or what am I missing? You know how we were talking before the podcast about what am I not writing about? It's almost like asking it those sort of questions, basically, to sort of understand what maybe we missed here.
Yeah. So is it like a reflection tool for a team who are creating
Almost.
something?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
help me understand where my
Yeah.
blind spots might be.
Yeah, and maybe exactly, and maybe it could be literal. Imagine you're a user of hard of seeing. Does this app work well still? And then, or how can we improve this in this?
Yeah,
regard?
I mean, the tricky thing there is going to be at some point you don't want to substitute those real experiences from users, and some elements of user research and co-production are not and co-design. They're not just about getting the right answer. They're about building that empathy in the team. So if it's helping a team build empathy, good.
Yeah.
If it's a shortcut to if it feels like it's ticking a box, not so much.
Yeah,
so,
predefined answer that you're looking for.
Yeah, but one to watch, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Should we talk a little bit about efficiencies in the public sector? Or is it very... We look a lot on we've done a bit of research on maturity and data maturity within public sector and getting into that space of AI, right? And quite a few cases, I think the stats that I've seen are there's currently about 70 or so workflows that are fully digitized, where the actual potential is in the thousands of use cases to get digitized. Do we see any meaningful steps or any advice from what you see in government and public services that can help organizations move closer to that efficiency without hindering their relationships with the public?
It's probably too early to say. I mean, there are examples of things like Beam, which you might have come across which is automatic transcription for social workers. So if they can spend more time talking to a client, more time with eye contact, more time actually understanding. That's great if that technology gets used for that. If it gets used to have less people because people are expensive and you end up doing a workshop, obviously not. So I think all application of AI in the public sector is over until we really know what works, and we don't know what works at the moment. Until we know what works, it needs some humility from government. There needs to be real honesty about what's working, what's not, what's being learned, and what didn't work, and that will get us towards an idea of what's where the real value is. There are definitely lots of things that could be automated. The thing I know from having worked on some quite big knotty public sector projects is that if you just digitize the process, you change its characteristics. So there are lots of things like land registration, for example, or welfare, where there are lots of manual processes in there. But if you just speed those processes up, you get other unintended consequences. So it really needs to be part of a wholesale service redesign. That's not to say there aren't opportunities to do bits here and there, but really you need to be at the same time thinking about end-to-end service redesign.
Services.
Because a digital version of a land registry or a welfare system does not look like a faster version of what's there at the moment. It's something different. And I think, again, citing India, Estonia, Ukraine, the things that they're doing, it's a reimagining of public infrastructure and public services.
Is this what you were talking about, where organizations design things that reflect themselves on the inside? Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
No, that's different. That's Conway's law, and that you end up that's the reason you if you phone up a bank and you want to talk to them about your mortgage and your savings account, you have to phone up twice. Because they're kind of different. That's Conway's law, and you get that with. So if you just had a child, for example, you've suddenly got to deal with 10 different bits of the state because they don't talk to each other. No, this is more that you if you speed up a process. So if you think about, let's take a hypothetical process where there's lots of people in it. So someone fills in a form and it goes in one end and there's lots of manual checking and it comes out the other end a month later and there's a decision. Okay. And let's say somebody wants to commit fraud against that system. well, actually, there's a lot of humans in that loop who maybe do spot things. If you suddenly get 1,000 new things coming in one day and they all look the same, they're all in the same handwriting, you're probably going to notice it. If you just automate that process without putting new safeguards in place, without recognizing that yes, you're taking cost out, but you might also be taking some value out as well in other ways. If you don't think about the redesign of the whole thing, you risk creating something where someone can metaphorically send in 1,000 things, and you don't know if their handwriting is different. We saw this a bit during COVID. Actually, it's a good example of this during COVID. So, and it's a comparison between two parts of the UK response and also UK response in India. So, in the UK, the welfare system actually stood up pretty well because it was digital. People didn't have to go to... suddenly, lots of people weren't working and needed extra money so they could feed their kids and pay their rent. And they didn't have to go to a job centre to do it. They could do it online. The digital identity was just about good enough to get people in, and they managed to... that worked, and it scaled and it handled it. The response for businesses was not so good because there's no channel for UK government to speak to businesses in a way that they can trust.
Yeah.
There's no digital identity for businesses as such.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no single channel to talk to them. You've got kind of Companies House over here and tax over here and local government over here. They had to just create a form where people said, yeah, please send me some money. I promise I'm a company and this is how I'm going to spend it. When Parliament looked into it last year or the year before, someone described it as eye-watering levels of fraud.
Yeah.
We're never getting that back as a country. That's gone. Again, compare that to India, where they had Aadhaar, digital identity system, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. There's a lot of moral, ethical questions to that's as raised because digital identity is hard, but because they were able to verify that business, that micro business, that farmer was genuinely that person, they were able to distribute money in real time with relatively low levels of fraud. So you see what I mean? Is if you just take a paper process, an analog process, and digitize it without thinking about how the properties of it change because it's digital, you risk creating unintended consequences. Yeah. And it's awful for the public as well. It's awful for the public and it's bad for the Treasury, which is never a good mix.
Yeah. With the India use case you mentioned, was the ethical question there about overreach or something like that? I know at the end of the book you talk about where does the public sector find itself in all of this? How do you decide where it starts and where it stops?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons that Aadhaar is controversial, which I'll try and do justice to some of them. But the thing I say in the book, though, is I think because India's done the first place to really do this at this kind of scale, actually, I don't think a lot of the ethical and political questions are because of the context of India. I think it's because India's done it first to some extent. Yeah. So it started out with the promise of making welfare more efficient, and it's slowly grown over time. So there is this argument that it's about overreach. The way it was created was also a bit controversial. So it was created via what's called a money bill. So it's a bit like, I think it's a bit like in the UK where finance bills can just be passed by the House of Commons. They don't get vetoed by the House of Lords. It had a slightly novel legislative creation story without the oversight that you would expect. And it has kind of begun to pop up in lots of different places in the private sector, in banking, and there's this kind of constant conversation in Indian civil society about what's appropriate and what's not. Okay. But I think every country is going to have its own form of that conversation when it comes to digital identity, when it comes to, I mean, you look at what's happening in the US at the moment with Doge, look, some of the ethical questions that are coming out in and around that. Technology is political. Like, we can't escape that technology is political, and for too long we've kind of treated it as this kind of this as ancillary thing, and it's really not. It's core to the operation of a modern digital state, and with that comes all the difficult political questions and contradictions with it.
Well, yeah, it's been for the past 2 decades. It's been more consumer products, hasn't it? That's basically what technology's been viewed as, and now we're kind of entering a new place where it's much more embedded into every little bit of it all. Yeah,
and there's definitely some people who kind of argue that there's elements of technology and digital which just shouldn't apply to the public sector. I don't think I'm one of those people. There are some areas like I'm convinced by digital voting, but I think if we don't take the opportunity to use tech to make people's lives better, then what's that going to do to trust in government in the long term? I think we've got to ask that question. It's not just enough to say, no, slow down, we can't do that. Need to be much. It's not enough to do that. You need to be able to do that and then say what you will do.
Yeah.
In a classic product management fashion, before we close, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing immediately, what would that be?
I'm going to have two things if that's not too tricky. I think one, because one of them is kind of hopefully already happening, and there's been in that included in that digital government blueprint I mentioned, which is making it much easier for the public sector, everything from local authorities to schools to hospitals to central government departments to issue digital credentials. I think that can be really transformational. The other thing I'd add is actually not so much about products, but about product teams. I think having product teams who've got more roaming permission within government to join things up, to look for opportunities that otherwise they're never going to rise to the top of anyone's set of priorities, and someone's going to write a business case about it, but there's real genuine need there. I really hope that there's some things in there AI opportunities play for actually there around like looking for opportunities, and there's some things there's some things in the blueprint around that, and that's really interesting. Teams who've got a bit more permission